Hey YNR fans! Waving hand, welcome to YNR Trends, your go-to spot for the juiciest Young and the Restless updates, shocking spoilers, and all the drama you can't stop talking about. From surprise returns to scandalous twists, we break it all down for you, every day. So grab your coffee, hit that subscribe button, and let's dive right into Genoa City's hottest gossip. Harrison Abbott might return home to pandemonium, according to spoilers for The Young and the Restless. When Audra Charles executes her latest vindictive scheme, Kyle Abbott and Claire Newman might not be able to conceal their relationship problems. Harrison's impending return home was a major topic of conversation in YNR's August 19th show. Harrison will soon be returning to Genoa City with Kyle and his other loved ones, after spending some time with Summer Newman in Milan. Claire, Harrison's previous nanny, has a unique relationship with him. With Harrison's intelligence and ability to take things up quickly, it will be difficult to conceal any growing turmoil. For some time now, Kyle and Claire have been dealing with an Audra crisis, but he wants to maintain their relationship. Claire is attempting to maintain her contempt for Audra and trust Kyle, but she may not be able to do so for long. You can bet that Audra will seek revenge because Claire is about to wreck her and Nate Hastings' romance. The relationship between Kyle and Claire may also be doomed because Audra will not tolerate that. Kyle continues to skirt the crucial question of what truly transpired in Nice behind closed doors. Claire is unaware that when Kyle was wearing a towel, he had a serious makeout session with Audra. Kyle left a lot out of that narrative since he even went so far as to lie on the bed with Audra beneath him. Audra might make it her goal to get Kyle tell the truth about their nearly explosive sleeping vehicle session. Kyle says there was no risk of it getting worse, but how can Claire be certain when he has been lying to her all along? Naturally, Audra can come up with other strategies to control the circumstance and intensify the already developing confrontation. Harrison might return home to complete upheaval, at least in regards to the breakdown of Kyle and Claire's relationship. According to teasers on The Young and the Restless, Harrison will receive updates on a lot of unexpected news after returning to GC, so keep checking back. Harrison's tiny footsteps reverberated more loudly than normal in the silent hallways as he ran back into the Abbott estate that afternoon. His presence had usually filled the house with noise and joy, but this time even a child could sense the tension in the air. For more than an hour, Kyle had been pacing while he waited for his son to return after a quick excursion with Jack. He had been attempting to divert his attention with pointless phone calls and professional emails, but the reality was that his thoughts were elsewhere. Since Claire had been residing at the estate for a few weeks, cracks had begun to appear, cracks large enough for Harrison to fall through, despite Kyle's desire to think it was working. Kyle was worried that his small son, who had already witnessed too much commotion in his early years, might begin to take attention. Furthermore, kids are always more perceptive than adults realize. When Claire emerged at the top of the stairs, her hair was neatly put back in a ponytail, but her anxious thoughts were evident from the strain in her eyes. She had been working harder than anybody could imagine to fit in with this world into which she had been thrown, a world of expectations, legacy, and generations-old family history. She had felt accepted by Kyle, who had even stood up for her when people questioned her, but recently she had sensed his trust eroding with each minor argument. Though she secretly feared that she might never really fit in with Kyle's or Harrison's lives, Claire still wanted to be tough and show herself. Even though Kyle vowed to believe in her, Claire couldn't help but wonder if his heart was still hers because she had made mistakes in the past that people were quick to remind her of. Harrison was jumping next to Jack as the front door flew open, holding a paper bag full of candies in one hand and a stuffed animal in the other. Harrison's smile, which was so full of delight that it could ease even the most intense anxiety, lighted up the room. Without hesitation, Kyle knelt down and embraced his son, buried his face in the boy's hair. That embrace's warmth served as a reminder to him of the importance of everything and the necessity of doing it perfectly at all costs. Claire descended the stairs cautiously, witnessing the reunion with a twinge of worry mixed with a small smile. Something inside of her held her back as she tried to get closer and join in that embrace. She wasn't sure whether Harrison really wanted her there anymore. Harrison had been staring at her differently lately, as if he could sense the tension between her and his father. Children's emotions were tender but brutally honest. That hurt her more than anything else. Inquiring about Harrison's journey with Grandpa Jack, Kyle withdrew and tousled his hair. Harrison talked eagerly about the chocolates that Jack grudgingly purchased after being pleaded with for what seemed like hours, about the toy store, and about the enormous stuffed bear he didn't get. Jack laughed, noticing the gap in the room but remaining silent as his gaze shifted between his son and Claire. Jack's instincts begged him to intervene, but he had been around long enough to know when not to. He had endured innumerable storms for his family, but he wasn't convinced that his counsel could help Kyle and Claire's predicament. Jack felt his son was going to have to learn the hard way that love wasn't always enough. Harrison, whose energy was unbridled even after a long day, ran upstairs to play as the evening wore on. As a result, Kyle and Claire were by themselves in the living room, with a gap of stillness separating them. Claire sat on the edge of the couch, her stance rigid, while Kyle, already exhausted, ran a hand through his hair. In reality, she already knew what was wrong, but she still wanted to question him. Schedules, discipline, and Claire's place in Harrison's life had been the topics of their recent disagreements, but at the heart of it all was the question neither of them wanted to face: were they clinging to something that had already passed them by, or were they truly meant to be together? The hush was finally broken by Claire, who spoke in a stern yet gentle tone. "Do you think Harrison is cool with my being here, Kyle?" Kyle was compelled to hesitate before responding to the question because it went deeper than he had anticipated. In reality, he wasn't sure, but he wanted to reassure her and say yes. Harrison was clinging to him more, he had observed, and he was asking more questions about his mother and why things felt different. However, Kyle was unable to bring himself to tell Claire that. "He just needs time," he remarked simply. Claire nodded, but her heart fell because she knew how much he had already been through. She believed that time had never been on her side. After Harrison had gone to bed that evening, Kyle sat by himself in his study and gazed at old pictures on his phone. Images of Harrison cuddling with his mother on the couch, laughing at Christmas, and grinning in the park. Kyle missed having that sense of security and being certain that his family was still together. At moments, it had felt genuine, even hopeful, as he attempted to move on and start a new relationship with Claire. However, he could no longer deny the concerns that had begun to creep in. Silently, Claire walked in and stood in the doorway, observing him. He was struggling to keep everything together, and she could see the agony in his eyes. He didn't respond when she said his name. He had lost the ability to speak. Harrison arrived downstairs the following morning to discover his father and Claire seated at the breakfast table, their quiet more audible than any argument. Sensing the tension, he tilted his head and innocently inquired, "Are you angry with each other?" After exchanging glances, Kyle and Claire realized that Harrison was already sensing the fissures, despite their best efforts to keep him safe. Kyle feigned a smile and assured Harrison that everything was all right, but kids could always tell when a statement was false. Harrison scowled before getting into his chair and silently eating his breakfast. That quiet was awful to Kyle. The mansion grew heavier every second as the days turned into weeks. Even Jack, who sought to defuse the tension with board games and family dinners, was unable to do so. When Ashley came to visit, she gave Kyle scathing yet straightforward advice, cautioning him that he must make a decision before things get worse. Kyle was aware that she was correct, but he still had to shatter someone's heart, either his own or Claire's. The way forward was painfully obvious if his love for her and his love for his son were at odds. Before Kyle made the decision for her, Claire struggled with the concept of leaving. She had put a lot of effort into this opportunity and this connection, but she wasn't sure she had the right to stay if Harrison's welfare was in jeopardy. She recalled how unpredictable and painful her own childhood had been, and she didn't want to cause that to another child. Kyle was the first person who had genuinely believed in her and made her feel deserving of love, so it felt hard to leave him. She couldn't bring herself to move her packed bag downstairs, so she sat up late at night and stared at it. Claire eventually confided in Kyle about her concern one evening after Harrison had gone to sleep. Her voice broke as she muttered, "Perhaps I don't belong here." The weight of his quiet was sufficient to soften Kyle's eyes. He couldn't lie any longer, but he didn't want to lose her. The reality was that things weren't going as planned. Thus, knowing that the future they had once dreamed together was vanishing, the two of them sat in that intolerable stillness while the fire crackled in the fireplace. Harrison had returned home, but not before reminding them both of the one reality they couldn't avoid: love alone, without harmony and without trust, wasn't enough to have a family. As Harrison turned the last corner onto the well-known tree-lined street, the rain started. The fine mist masked the world's boundaries and turned the harsh streetlight shine into hazy aureoles. This weather served as an appropriate cloak for his return. It reflected the atmosphere he carried inside, a damp chill of uncertainty that was unrelated to the outer temperature. The harsh, sun-bleached scenery of a faraway desert and the strict, clear-cut structure of military service had characterized his 3 years away. He was re-entering a world of delicate edges and complex allegiances, where the rules of interaction were unwritten, ever-changing, and intensely personal. He was returning home, but what he meant by home was now up for debate. The house at the end of the cul-de-sac where his brother Kyle and his wife Claire resided had the same coordinates. However, he feared that the emotional terrain was mined and unexplored. His coming was not unexpected, but it was an encroachment. A rectangle of bright yellow light spilled over the wet driveway as the front door opened before he could even turn off the motor. In the doorway, Kyle stood in silhouette, his stance a mix of eager tension and something else, something reserved. Harrison felt the weight of his duffel bag as he stepped outside into the rain, not only as a physical burden but also as a reminder of who he had been before leaving. Harrison's loyalty was obvious, and he was simpler. The Harrison who was approaching his brother was an outsider acclimating to an unfamiliar environment. A study in macho discomfort, the first embrace was a forceful, backslapping hug that was just a beat too tight, a fraction of a second too long, and conveyed a relief that words were too difficult to convey. Kyle remarked, "Look at you," as he withdrew while keeping his hands on Harrison's shoulders. Under the harder lines and the new, vigilant stillness in his eyes, he looked over his brother's face, trying to find the boy he remembered. The sentiment was sincere, yet it lingered in midair like a balloon awaiting its counterweight. "God, it's good to have you back." Then, right behind Kyle's shoulder, Claire appeared. She gave him a grin that was a masterwork of contradictory feelings, a sincere joy at seeing him, a nervousness that caused it to flutter at the edges, and a deep fatigue that appeared to come from her very being. She said, "Harrison," in a softer, more hesitant voice than he remembered. She moved closer and gave him a quick, cautious embrace that ended before he could fully process it. He was somewhat confused by the quick, strong blast of memory from her perfume, which was floral and familiar. He was Harrison, standing uncomfortably near to his brother's wife, intensely conscious of the distance between them, and not a soldier returning from deployment in that moment. The mansion itself served as a museum showcasing the life he had previously led. The images on the walls documented a common past, including birthdays, Christmases, and a coastal trip, and the furnishings was largely unchanged. It was a different environment, though. It felt coerced rather than organic, and it was too quiet and orderly. Instead of the untidy comfort of peace, it was the immaculate quiet of a truce. Everything appeared to be covered in a light layer of household dust, but Harrison's trained senses were able to identify the cracks beneath it. There was a small split in the drywall close to the archway, which had been quickly repaired but left unpainted. The groaning of a certain floorboard in the hallway, a novel noise, a sign of changing foundations. Harrison, who was educated to evaluate stability and spot risks, saw these minor details as data points even if they had no significance to others. They were signs. Pleasantries and stilted talk filled the first evening. They used broad, sterile language when discussing his trip and his absence. Harrison provided stories free of boredom, terror, and the destructive tension of waiting, anecdotes fit for civilian consumption. Leaning forward as though attempting to take in his brother's experiences through close proximity, Kyle listened with an eager intensity. As if waiting for a signal that only she could see, Claire's eyes frequently strayed to the window and the unrelenting rain as she traveled between the kitchen and the living room. Her interest in a careful performance was evident in the courteous questions she asked. Harrison could see how much work it took, how much energy it took to keep up the appearance of the hospitable hostess while it was obvious that her personal energies were severely exhausted. Harrison was an unintentional auditor from the minute he walked through the door. He was an outsider, a mute observer thrust into the center of an ongoing battle. Neither Kyle nor Claire had completely taken into consideration the variable of his presence. Harrison's reappearance was seen by Kyle as a possible lifeline, a return to a more straightforward dynamic of fraternity and mutual understanding. He made an almost desperate attempt to win Harrison over as an ally and bring him into his orbit. As if for protection, he would give him a bit too many pats on the back, make jokes about a childhood Claire was not allowed to have, and erect a small fort of male friendship. Harrison's arrival was a different kind of issue for Claire. It was another person to act for, another set of eyes to see her marriage slowly fall apart. But she also discovered an odd, unsaid relief in his silent observation. He didn't ask her to do anything. Unlike Kyle, he didn't attempt to tease her out of her silence. His quiet was merely a space, not a condemnation. Harrison had learned in the military the importance of quiet and listening to the negative space around oneself in addition to speech. The things they didn't say were heard by him. "What do you feel like eating?" is a straightforward question regarding dinner plans. May have a history of unfulfilled expectations and recommendations that were turned down. Kyle's upbeat description of his workday was a monologue directed at Claire, who gave him only brief, quiet nods, a captive audience of one. There were no arguments, thus there was no tension. The conflict Kyle and Claire were engaged in was a Cold War, an attrition-based conflict fought by strategic retreats and silence. The careful distribution of domestic duties, as well as a timetable affixed to the refrigerator, indicated the necessity for complete equity due to the breakdown of confidence. The fact that they shared a room yet lived far apart, Kyle engrossed in his phone, Claire in a book, made the area between them on the sofa seem like an impassable no-man's land. It was in their cautious, courteous language, so devoid of passion or spontaneity that it was like reading from a screenplay for a play that they both hoped would never be. The soldier Harrison knew his methods. He could plainly see theirs. Kyle's approach was a relentless, low-grade attack on normalcy and overpowering positivism, which was intended to bury the issue and make it go away with sheer willpower. This type of denial was so strong that it had a gravitational pull of its own. Claire adopted a policy of disengagement. She had strengthened her emotional boundaries by withdrawing inward. Her careful attention to the house and her silence served as her armor and means of maintaining control over the one kingdom she still had. There were two opposing forces waiting for the other to surrender as they were buried in their separate trenches. He was unable to untangle the knot of loyalty. Because of their common struggles as children and the unbreakable link of family, he and Kyle had a fundamental bond. A strong, innate desire to stand by his brother and help him was evoked by witnessing his suffering and his bewildered, thrashing attempts to connect. He was able to observe Claire's loneliness, though, as she quietly drowned in a sea of unsaid complaints. He recalled her from their first time together, the sparkle in her eyes, the effortless laughter. Although she was buried beneath layers of loneliness and hatred, that lady was still there. In some ways, it felt like a betrayal of his brother to acknowledge her sorrow. His own presence acted as a catalyst, quickening months-long simmering emotions. They were compelled to look in the mirror by his unbiased observation. During a supper that was a monument to awkward silence one evening, Kyle cracked a joke that had always been a part of their family's vocabulary. Harrison gave a partial smile. Claire stared at her dish without responding. In a different setting, the joke might have been innocuous, but when it fell into the tight silence of the room like a stone in a still pond, the consequences were disastrous. "Claire, do you not recall that?" Kyle pressed, a hint of desperation in his voice. He was attempting to compel a connection by drawing her into the memories. Claire looked up, her face completely blank and flawlessly composed. "I remember," she continued, her voice lifeless. Harrison heard a whole history of feeling like a stranger in her own family's tale and of being excluded from that brotherly bond in just 2 words. Kyle's expression collapsed, exposing the unadulterated desperation underneath the fake smile. Even though it was a little and insignificant moment, it was everything. In that interaction, Harrison witnessed the whole structure of their suffering: Kyle's need for approval, Claire's refusal to give it, and the vicious cycle of hurt and rejection that kept getting worse. Harrison went downstairs for a glass of water later that night since he couldn't sleep. Claire was sitting in the dark in the living room, with only the dim blue light from her laptop to light her. Her profile was engraved with a melancholy so deep it made his chest hurt, but she wasn't working, she was just staring at the computer. She snapped the laptop shut as soon as she heard him, making a loud noise in the otherwise silent house. "Not able to sleep?" Her voice was a whisper as she requested. "No," he replied. "You?" She laughed a little, without humor. She looked at him then, actually looked at him, and the mask came off. That's a permanent state these days. He could see the woman's vulnerability and weariness in the low light, as she battled a war she had no idea how to win. "You must find it odd," she remarked. "Simply being here. Observing this." He was at a loss for words. It would be offensive to deny. It felt like a betrayal to agree. So he just nodded, accepting the reality without passing judgment. It seemed like a eulogy when she said, "He's a good man, your brother. I believe I've simply lost the ability to be content with him. Or perhaps he has lost the ability to be content with me. Something brittle is what we've created. And we've stopped moving altogether because we're both so terrified of making the incorrect choice." Harrison was more than a soldier or a brother at that instant. He confessed. He had been pondering the conflict in silence, and now she was putting it into words. It wasn't about a single, disastrous incident or betrayal. It was about the death of 1,000 cuts, unfulfilled promises, unremembered anniversaries, incomplete discussions, and unappreciated touches. It was the gradual, undetectable disintegration of a common world until 2 isolated, lonesome islands inside the same 4 walls were all that remained. A reset, a diversion, or fresh vitality to break the stale routines had been possible with his reappearance. However, it had accomplished more. A mirror had been held up by it. Kyle could no longer pretend that everything was all right in his silent, perceptive presence. The fact that he could see his brother noticing the cracks made him feel ashamed, which showed out as more frenzied joviality. Harrison's testimony was both a burden and a relief to Claire. Being able to observe her discontent was both draining and gratifying. Her suffering was validated by another person's wordless comprehension. It was no longer a lone, fictitious thing. Harrison expected to find comfort in the comforts of home. He anticipated letting go of his deployment's hypervigilance and settling into his family's gentle, unquestioning safety.